Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Hope you had an amazing week as usual. Now you probably guessed what this video is about, but yeah, wheel builds. I did a wheel build tutorial about 3 or 4 years ago, certainly quite early into this channel, and it's done pretty well. It's been ticking along over the years and it's sitting at just under 500,000 views, which is pretty nuts. But as popular as it is, it certainly wasn't a perfect video. Like I mentioned, it was early on in my channel, my audio wasn't great, I added some music just a little bit too loud, and I still get messages from people who can't quite work out how to do the key spokes, so I think there's room to improve on that description. But anyway, got my hex here. It is due time some new wheels. Now I must admit, these wheels have been absolutely solid, there's nothing wrong with them, but I've got new sponsored parts, I've got some new light bicycle rims. They want me running nice shiny new parts, so it'd be rude of me to say no to some new wheels. I'm also going to use this time to say a massive thanks to Chris King for their hubs. They've been amazing, they've coped so well over the last couple of years. I haven't really had any issues with them, but I would like just a few more engagement points. 72, it's not a low amount, but for trials riding, more is usually better. So I'm moving from 72 engagement points to over 600 with Industry 9 hubs, and I'll show you those in a little while. But back to this particular video, rather than show you the full process from lacing to truing to the final wheel, I'm going to break it up a little bit and I'm going to concentrate purely on the lacing for this video. I'll then make a part 2, which is going to be adding the tension, truing, stressing the wheel, all that stuff, and that's going to be a future video. Anyway, I think that's enough chat. I'm going to stick the camera on the roof and start explaining what parts I'm using, and then we'll get onto the lacing. So let's do it. Before we do the lacing, I'm just going to run through what I'll be using, from the hubs, rims, spokes, nipples, to the tools that I'm going to be using to lace the wheel. The hubs I'm using are the new Industry 9 Hydra hubs. Got the pair front and rear for my bike. The rim I'll be using is Light Bicycle's Recon rim. This is the RM26CO5. It's 38mm wide, deep profile, and has been the rim I've been using for the last 3 years, and I've never broken one. Because it's carbon and really wide, it's the stiffest rim I've ever used and perfect for trials riding. The spokes I'm using are the spokes I always use. I swear by these. I've hardly ever broken one in the 10-15 years, however long I've been using them. They're Sapin double butted spokes, and yes, super light, super strong, perfect spokes. If you're a mountain biker or a road rider or someone who's going to be riding in muddy, wet, salty conditions, I do recommend using brass nipples. But because I ride my bike pretty much only in the dry, I tend to use alloy nipples. A lot of people are scared of alloy nipples. They think they're just going to snap, but like I said, I've been running my wheels for 2 years and I've never broken one. I don't ride in particularly wet conditions, so corrosion is less of an issue. And like my original video, I still get all my spokes from a bike shop called Tarty Bikes, based in the UK but will ship worldwide. They have their own spoke calculator, which you do have to phone up for them to use, but it is the most accurate I've found by far. You just tell them what rim and hub you have and they'll calculate the spoke length, and I've never had it wrong. Having a wheel truing stand will make finishing the wheel so much easier, but for lacing a wheel we don't actually need one of these. For actually lacing the wheel, a nipple driver will make life a hell of a lot easier. These are just such a super quick, easy way of threading the nipple onto the spoke. But you don't need one of these, they just make life a little bit easier. Now a nipple driver tool fits a fairly traditional style of nipple with a screwdriver slot at the back, but a lot of modern nipples actually come with a Torx fitting where this won't fit. So if you do have a modern wheel which takes Torx style nipples, then it's a worthy investment to get a Torx nipple driver. And speaking of making life easier, this is a nipple holder, or it would be if the nipple holding part hadn't broken. This is a great tool for stopping your nipples from falling into the rim and just rattling about and getting lost. It holds onto the nipple just at the right tension that you can put it through the rim, thread it onto the spoke, and it doesn't get lost inside the rim. An alternative to this is just using a spoke. This works simply by threading the nipple on backwards, which then allows you to put it through the rim, stopping it getting lost inside. Tarty Bikes usually supply an extra spoke or two, so you can simply use one of those spares as a nipple holder. Okay, now that I've shown you what kit I'm using, what tools I'm going to be using, it's time to build the wheel. Now there's a lot of different lacing patterns you can do when building a traditional spoked wheel like this. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I will cover some of the most common. And there's actually a really simple trick which works for all of these lacings that I'm going to show you, that allows you to get them first time, every time, pretty easily. Now I tried to explain this in my original wheel build, and despite it being quite an easy concept, it can be a little bit tricky to explain. So rather than show you in real life with the kit I've got here, I've made some drawings, so let's go to those. So I'm finally putting my art and design diploma to good use. I've drawn the components I'm going to use, and as you can see here, I've added quite a few layers to show you a few different lacing patterns. I want this one to be super detailed, so I've gone the extra mile. This took me hours to do. I'm not going to show you all the spoke patterns just because there's far too many. I'm going to show you some of the more common ones, including radial, 1 cross, 2 cross, 3 cross, and maybe even 4 cross as well. The technique I'm going to show you works for all of these spoke patterns, and it doesn't matter what wheel size you have or how many spoke holes you have. No matter the lacing type, your wheel size, the spoke count, these are the two most important spokes in a whole wheel build, and it's pretty vital you get them in the right spot. Fortunately, the technique I'm going to show you makes it really easy to get these in exactly the right spot, no matter what lacing pattern you're going to do. It even allows you to have different spoke patterns on either side of the wheel. So say if you want to have 3 cross on one side, radial on the other, this technique will allow you to do that. One word of advice before you get started is to check whether the rim you're going to use is asymmetrical or not. And by that I mean, do your spokes come out directly in the middle of the rim, or do they come out on one side? If they come out on one side, that is an asymmetrical rim. It will have a left and right hand specific side, so it's important you get this the right way around, matching your hubs when you're lacing your wheels. If you get your asymmetrical rim lined up correctly, then it will just build up like normal. If you have what looks like a normal non-asymmetric rim, then you don't have to worry so much about a left and right hand side. Although one thing to bear in mind is your spoke holes might actually be drilled at a slight angle. So just be aware that when you're fitting your spokes, this angle is pointing to the correct flange. The last thing to note before we move on is that I build my wheels vertically with the valve hole at the 12 o'clock position. So later on when I'm doing the lacing, I'll be referring to a left and right hand side of the valve. So to avoid confusion, make sure your wheel is lined up the same as mine with the valve at the 12 o'clock position. So I think that's enough prep work. Let's move on and I'll show you the different lacing patterns and their pros and cons. Radial, as the name suggests, is where the spokes come radially out of the hub. Now you don't really see radial that often these days unless it's a super light road bike or a retro mountain bike. So what are the good things about radial? Well, first of all, it's the lightest because the spokes are taking the shortest route from the hub to the rim. The shorter the spokes, the less material, the lighter the weight. Supposedly the wheel is going to be stiffer side to side as well. This is because the spokes are more triangulated, and the more triangulated the spokes, the stiffer the wheel will be. So if you have a lightweight super flimsy rim, lacing the wheel radially will actually help the wheel stiffness a bit. Now that is just theory. I don't know whether it does actually make the wheel stiffer. I've run radial wheels in the past and I've never noticed any difference. But being a trials rider, I do tend to use thicker, sturdier rims, so maybe I would notice the extra stiffness if I wasn't already using a fairly stiff rim. One other advantage to radial lacing is if you do snap a spoke, it's a lot easier to replace it because you don't have to interweave it in between all the other crosses. And this lack of interweaving makes radial lacing the easiest type of wheel to build. But what are the disadvantages to a radial wheel? Now there's only really a couple of disadvantages to radial, but unfortunately they are really big issues. To explain, I've got a closer illustration of a hub with the spokes. Now with radial spokes coming directly out of the hub, you're actually pulling against the smallest section of material. This unfortunately means that some hubs can snap when built radially. Some hub manufacturers will actually design their wheels to be run radial, and to get around the flanges snapping, they'll simply just make the flanges thicker. By adding this extra material, you're just making it less likely to snap the flange. If you're thinking of lacing a wheel radially, I would recommend looking for a hub that is reinforced. That said, if your hub does have just fairly standard flanges, it's not definitely going to snap, but you are taking the risk. The other major disadvantage to radial is that the spokes don't handle torque very well. This means I wouldn't recommend radial wheels if you're using a disc brake or on the drive side of the rear hub. This is why you'll nearly always see radial wheels on a bike that uses rim brakes. You might see radial on the rear of a road bike, but you won't see it on the drive side. So, the pros. It's the lightest, it's the easiest to lace, and it makes the wheels stiffest laterally. However, the cons are it's more stressful on the hub and it's not great with handling torque. Even though the cons are fairly big cons, there's still definitely situations where a radial wheel is a good idea. Now maybe you don't have the correct length spokes for radial, so let's start to add some crosses to them. So the next logical step from radial is one cross. I've removed some spokes here to make it easy to see, and as the name suggests, the spokes literally cross each other just one time. Now one cross is a slightly weird lacing pattern. It's one you won't see that often and is usually used if you don't have the correct length spoke for radial. One cross is also fairly unique in that there's actually quite a few different ways to lace the wheel. But I'll go into more detail about that when I show you how to lace this. Before that though, like radial, what are the pros and cons? Because the spokes are now pulling at a slight angle, it's effectively making the flange thicker. And like I mentioned with radial, some hub manufacturers will make their flanges thicker to cope with the extra stress, so by angling the spokes, you're effectively doing that job for them. But that said, the angle these spokes are leaving the hub isn't that much, so the thickness of material you're pulling against is still pretty small. It's going to be slightly less stressful on the hub than radial, but you do still risk snapping the flange. In the same vein of being slightly less stressful on the hub compared with radial, it'll also cope slightly better with torque. But like I mentioned with the flange strength, it's only marginal gains and I wouldn't recommend one cross for disc brake use or on the drive side rear wheel. So what are the pros to one cross? Well, you get a slightly stronger hub flange and it is slightly better for torque. However, the cons are it's not as light as radial and it's still not suitable for discs or drive side use. And this to me is why one cross is quite an odd lacing pattern. You don't get the full advantages of radial, and you don't get any of the full advantages of adding more crosses. It's kind of like the weird kid next door that your parents always ask you to go play with. It's fine, but there are better options out there. And speaking of better options, let's add a cross and move to two cross. So for your viewing pleasure, here we have a two cross wheel. I've removed some spokes so it's easier to see the pattern, and as the name suggests, the spokes cross each other at 2 points. Unlike one cross, two cross is now starting to become a much more practical lacing pattern. If we go back down to the hub flange, you'll see the spokes are now leaving at much more of an angle. And like I mentioned with one cross, the more of an angle the spokes leave the flange, the more material they'll be pulling against, which artificially makes the hub flange thicker. By simply adding an extra cross with two cross, you're going to reduce the stresses on the hub flange significantly. Not only that, but now your wheel will cope significantly better with torque forces. Two cross is the minimum number of crosses I would suggest with a disc brake. However, I wouldn't recommend two cross if you're thinking of going for a big rotor like a 200mm. In that instance, I would suggest at least three cross. But if you plan on using a small rotor, then it should be fine, and likewise it should be fine on the drive side rear if you're a lighter rider. Now going back to lateral stiffness, like I mentioned earlier, radial is supposedly the stiffest laterally. So if you're using a lightweight rim, you may find it slightly easier to actually buckle the wheel once you start to add more crosses. But it's all a compromise. That stiffness you lose laterally, you more than make up with the ability to cope with torque. So what are the pros of two cross? Well, it's less stress on the hub flange and it can handle more torque. But what about the cons? Well, it's heavier. That's because the spokes are now longer, so obviously longer spokes, more material is heavier. It's also harder to lace and replace a broken spoke. Now that you've got the spokes crossing and interweaving over each other, replacing a broken spoke means you have to thread it through all the other ones. When I say it's harder to lace, yeah, it's going to be slightly harder than one cross, but if you follow the techniques I'm going to show you, it actually works out to be pretty easy. The last con is the potential for reduced lateral stiffness. This is more noticeable if you're running a lightweight rim that's more flexible, but if like me you're running quite a burly stiff carbon rim, then you're not going to notice this so much. So you may notice there's more cons than there are pros. However, in my opinion, the benefit of the pros far outweighs any negative effect of the cons. So there you go, that's two cross, the start of the more practical lacing patterns. Let's step this up once more and go to three cross. So here we have three cross. Again, here's a couple of layers removed so you can see the pattern more easily, and of course no prizes for guessing how many times the spokes cross over each other this time. Yep, if it wasn't obvious, 3 cross means the spokes cross 3 times. Now one of those crosses is right down on the hub flange, so these can be hard to miss when you first look at a wheel. But no matter if the cross is down at the hub, in the middle, or further towards the rim, it counts as a cross. 3 cross is by far the most common spoke lacing pattern you're going to find out in the real world. It has the best compromise between lateral stiffness, weight and ability to handle extreme torques. The spokes are now pulling at such an angle there's a lot more material to resist the high forces. And also because one spoke's being pulled one way, one spoke's being pulled the other way, you're actually compressing them together down here, which again helps to make the hub last a lot longer. Like how I mentioned with 1 and 2 cross, the wheel in theory won't be as stiff laterally side to side. I feel it's my duty to mention this, however in the real world it's a non-issue. Your wheel won't be weaker, it won't magically buckle after every single ride, if you build it right, so don't worry about the theory of it being slightly less stiff laterally. Instead, just be stoked that now you can pretty much run any rotor size that you want. The higher angle the spokes are now leaving the hub means you have little worry about snapping the flanges, and the angles and extra spoke crossings mean it'll handle a load more torque. And of course this is absolutely fine to run on the drive side rear. So just like before, let's go through the pros and cons for 3 cross, starting with the pros. I personally think that 3 cross has the best all-round strength. There's a reason why 3 cross is the most common spoke lacing pattern. You'll find it anywhere from cross-country bikes, road bikes, downhill bikes, even really cheap bikes you find in Walmart. 3 cross has one of the best all-round abilities to resist side-to-side buckling and the torque from drivetrains and bigger brakes. Which leads me to the second pro, just how well it can cope with the torque. Like I mentioned earlier, 3 cross will cope absolutely fine even with some of the biggest rotors you can get, and it also cope with trials riding type torque on the drivetrain. But how about the cons? Now I've only written one down here, and that's that it's heavier. However, compared with 2 cross, you're not going to notice the extra weight for 3 cross. The only time you're really going to notice any difference in weight is, say, compared with Radial. But even then, we're only talking about a few extra grams. Now I was going to mention that this is slightly harder to lace, but compared with 2 cross, it's not. It's pretty much exactly the same technique. And likewise, I could mention it's harder to replace a spoke if it snaps, but again, compared with 2 cross, it's pretty much exactly the same. I mean, yeah, compared with Radial, it is going to be harder to lace and harder to replace a spoke, but if you want your wheel to cope with the extra forces of a bigger disc brake, or if you put in lots of torque through the drivetrain, then it's definitely worth a little extra faff to get a 3 cross lacing pattern. So there we go, that is 3 cross. Now there's only one more I'm going to show you, and that is 4 cross. So this is a 4 cross wheel. A little bit like 1 cross, it's a slightly unusual lacing pattern. Much like you might choose to use 1 cross if you don't have the correct length spokes for Radial, you might choose to go 4 cross if you don't have the correct length spokes for 3 cross. And it's for that very reason that for my personal wheels I'm about to build, I'm actually choosing to go 4 cross myself. So once again, remove some spokes to give you a clearer view. And even though it may only look like it crosses 3 spokes, it does actually cross over this spoke down here right down at the head. So a little bit like 3 cross, it can be hard to miss that final cross right down at the flange. So despite 4 cross being my personal choice for my wheels, there are some disadvantages. The main disadvantage is, as you can see here, it's starting to get pretty busy down on the hub flange. If you have a smaller flange, there's simply not going to be enough room for the spokes to smoothly cross over each other. So on a smaller flanged hub, it may not be physically possible to even run 4 cross. But on the plus side, as you might imagine, 4 cross has no issue with running bigger rotors. With the extra support of all the extra crosses and the angles the spokes are going at, 4 cross is excellent at resisting torque stress. The other bonus is, just look how much more flange material there is to resist cracking. You now have 2 spokes which are compressing towards each other, which the hub can cope with much better than just trying to shear off a smaller part of the flange. So again, the pros and cons, starting with the pros. 4 cross has excellent resistance to torque. Like I mentioned, you can pretty much run any size rotor you want without worry. 4 cross might also be a good option if you're on an e-bike or if you're just worried about any extra torque you're going to put on the drivetrain. 4 cross will have no problems with any demanding drivetrain loads. And also, like I mentioned, it's less stressful on the flange just because you're pulling against the most material possible. And for the cons, well, the list has got slightly longer than when we looked at 3 cross. I'm Got to start with saying it's heavier, yet again over 3 cross, 2 cross, 1 cross, radial, especially radial. 4 cross will be heavier because again the spokes are going to be even longer. It also might not fit a smaller hub. The Industry 9 Hydra hubs I'm going to be using have medium to large size flanges. If you are using a hub with a smaller flange, then yeah, you may not physically be able to fit 4 cross. Then lastly, it's harder to lace. Now I know I didn't mention this in the 3 cross build, but once the crossings start to get extra tight down on the flange, it does make it slightly harder to lace the wheel. And of course, if you end up snapping a spoke, then these tight crossings will make replacing it even harder. So that is 4 cross, and also concludes my introduction to the most common spoke lacing patterns. I really hope my descriptions help find the best spoke pattern for you. I'm now going to go through the individual spoke patterns and show you how to lace them. So radial is quite a unique pattern to build. If you've been watching this video from the start, you'll have seen that all of the patterns I've shown you have color coordinated spokes. If we take a side view of a hub, for example, normally the spokes would alternate from each side of the flange, and because of this I build a wheel in quarters. However, with radial, all the spokes will go in the same side of the flange. So rather than use 4 different coloured spokes for each side of both flanges, we've only got 2 colours, pink and yellow, because we're only going to use one side of each flange. You may also notice the odd one out, we have a single green spoke. I've highlighted this one because this is the key spoke. This is the most important spoke in the entire wheel build, and one that you definitely need to get in the right place. Now another reason why radial is unique is that there's no second key spoke. If you watch some of the later lacing patterns I'm going to show you, there's actually 2 key spokes, 2 spokes that are absolutely vital you get in the right place. And yes, technically radial does have 2 key spokes, but because of the way I'm going to show you how to lace this wheel, it's not actually as vital to know about it. The last unique thing about radial is there's actually a couple of ways you can actually put the spoke through the flange. And if you're a wheel builder, you may have already noticed I've drawn it a certain way. This is the way I personally like to lace my radial wheels, but not everyone does it this way. Personally, I don't think there's a right and wrong way to do it, but I'll explain what I do and why. Before I can explain fully, it's worth noting that the head of the spoke is broken into 2 halves. You have the fatter domed section. This is the part that stops the spoke from threading all the way through the hub, and is known as the head of the spoke. The other part is the near 90-degree bend in the spoke, and this is called the shoulder. So later on, if I'm talking about heads or I'm talking about shoulders, I'm not talking about washing my hair, I'm just talking about which side of the spoke is going on which side of the flange. So for example, the one on the left here has the head on the inside of the flange and the shoulder on the outside, whereas the one on the right here has the head on the outside and the shoulder on the inside. So when I mention heads in, shoulders out, this is what I mean, and if I'm talking heads out, shoulders in, then this is what I mean. If you've built a radial wheel or seen one in the real world, then it may look something a little like this, although you have to excuse my fairly bad drawing on this one. If we go to a slightly better drawn version, you can see all the shoulders are on the inside and all the heads are on the outside. I'd say this is the most common way that people build a radial wheel, however it's not the way that I do it. I actually do it the opposite way, with the heads on the inside and the shoulders on the outside. Some people may say that this is the wrong way to do it, but I've personally done this with my own wheels in the past. I've done it with other people's wheels, and I'll explain why I think this is the slightly better way of doing it. So I've drawn a quick hub side profile here, and this is what it would look like with all the heads on the outside and shoulders on the inside. And likewise, this is what it looks like the way I do it, with the heads on the inside and the shoulders on the outside. I should probably point out that yes, this is a disc hub, and yes, I know I said I don't recommend radial with disc hubs, but just imagine this is a non-disc front hub. So here's another angle of what radial would look like with the heads on the outside and shoulders on the inside. And the reason why I don't use this pattern is because the distance between the spokes isn't as wide as it could be. By lacing the wheel the opposite way, with the heads on the inside and shoulders on the outside, you're making the distance between the spokes a little bit wider. And I think most people would agree that a wider triangle is going to be stiffer than a narrower triangle. So simply by building a radial wheel with the heads on the inside, shoulders on the outside, you're potentially getting a slightly stiffer wheel. The other advantage of going heads in, shoulders out, is that it's a lot easier to fit the spokes if you've already got a cross pattern on one side. For example, you might want to go 3 cross on the drive side rear to handle the extra torque forces, but you still may want to be radial on the non-drive side to save some weight. By having the heads on the inside and the shoulders on the outside, It makes it a lot easier to thread the spokes through the gaps in the cross pattern on the drive side. If you put the spokes going in the opposite way, with the heads on the outside and the shoulders on the inside, it makes it a lot harder to get the spokes in between the crosses that have already been set. So to me, doing it the way I do it is a massive benefit for ease of lacing if you've already got a cross pattern on one side of the wheel. Anyway, that's enough chat about heads and shoulders and why I build Radial the way I do. Let's get on to actually building it. Like I mentioned earlier, we only have two coloured spokes. This means we build the wheel in two halves. So this means we can get rid of the second half spokes and just concentrate on the first half. But before we do the full half, we're going to concentrate on the key spoke. Once you've fitted this to the correct place on the hub and the correct place on the rim, the rest of the 16 spokes on this half will just naturally fit into place. Now I'm mentioning 16 because this is a 32 hole wheel, so obviously half of 32 is 16. Once we start to alternate the flange holes, this number will half again and we'll be talking about 8 spokes. But we'll talk about that more when we get into the later spoke lacings. So, how do we know how to get the key spoke in exactly the right place? Well, fortunately there's a really easy system to do this which works for Radial 1 cross, 2 cross, 3 cross, 4 cross, and I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So if we go back to this angle of a hub, and again ignore the fact there's a disc mount, let's pretend this is a non-disc hub. Now if your hub has a logo, you want to be able to see that through the valve hole. You don't get any structural advantage to this, you just get bonus points from other wheel builders. If your hub doesn't have a logo, then you can ignore this first step. So to begin, find your hub logo if you have one, and find the centermost point. From that center point, draw an imaginary line down through the hub towards you over the flange you're about to lace. Now at this point on a non-disc front hub, don't worry too much about which side you're starting on. This technique works on either side of the flange with no differences. Once you've drawn that imaginary line down through the hub towards you, you want to look for the spoke hole on the flange that's closest to that center line. Now if that line happens to end up exactly between two spoke holes, then I'd recommend choosing the hole to the left. But more than likely you'll have one hole which is obviously closer to the center line. This will be your key spoke position for Radial. This is going to be the first spoke you put in and the one that sets the rest of the pattern. So just to recap, you find that center line from the logo on the hub, follow it through towards you through the flange you're about to lace, find the spoke hole that's closest to that center line, and that is your key spoke hole. Now it's simply a case of passing that first key spoke through the hole. Now if you want to build it the way I build it, again that's heads on the inside and shoulders on the outside, with a spoke coming towards you. If you want to build it the other way, with the heads on the inside, shoulders on the outside, then the spoke will be put in going away from you. Now it's completely up to you if you want to go ahead and add that key spoke to the rim now, or if you want to put the rest of the 16 spokes in. It's my personal preference to put all 16 spokes in now, simply because it makes the wheel build just a little bit quicker. However, with all the spokes in, it can make it a little bit confusing to keep track of the key spoke. So when I'm putting the rest of the spokes in, I normally keep hold of the key spoke in some way, either with a finger, a thumb, whatever. I just keep hold of the key spoke so I don't lose it. And once all 16 spokes are in, I can then start fitting them to the rim, starting with the key spoke. If you're going to fit the key spoke as soon as you fitted it, fine. If you're going to fit all 16, that's fine as well. Just imagine they're kind of dangling down from the hub now. Using the technique I showed you by following the center line of the hub and finding the spoke hole closest to it, we found the position of the key spoke on the hub, but where does it go on the rim? So like I mentioned, with the valve at the 12 o'clock position, the key spoke goes from the hub, and we're actually going to put that in the first hole to the left of the valve hole. So once again, that first key spoke, we follow that up to the rim, and that goes to the first hole to the left of the valve. Now that you got that spoke in the rim, be careful that the hub doesn't twist around on its axis. This is less important on a radial wheel because the spoke is pretty much in the center of the logo. The wheel will still build up pretty much the same anyway. But as soon as you start building a wheel with a lacing pattern that crosses, it's vital that you don't let the hub spin. So it's good practice not to let it spin now either. So once your key spoke is in place on the hub and the rim, you can start adding the rest of the 16 spokes. And this is as simple as going every second spoke hole on the rim. Once all 16 spokes are in place, it should look like this. Don't worry too much if your spokes are protruding just slightly out of the rim. This will be more common on a shallow rim, but as soon as you add the other half of the spokes, these will actually be pulled further into the rim. And speaking of the other half of the spokes, it's time to fit those. To add the second half of the spokes is actually easier than the first half because you don't have to worry about a key spoke position. Because we've already set all 16 spokes on the first flange, the radial pattern is already set. So it doesn't really matter which hole you start with on the second half. As long as you make sure these second spokes go radially from the hub in a straight line to the rim, then the pattern will be good. So it's simply a case of choosing a hole, threading the spokes through to match the pattern you did in the first half, either heads in, shoulders out, or shoulders out, heads in, and then you have a choice of either fitting that to the rim now, or do what I do and fit all 16 spokes now to save a little bit of time. So once your second half of the spokes are fitted, it will look something like this. Like I mentioned, as long as these second half spokes you're going to put in are going straight radially from the hub to the rim, then the pattern will be good. Because we've already fitted the first half, it'll be fairly obvious where the second half goes, pretty much just in the remaining holes left. One thing you may find if you build with the heads in and shoulders out is that the spokes bow quite a lot. If you're finding your spokes are a little on the short side, then attempting to straighten the spokes now will actually help you get a little bit more reach. To get the spokes running a little bit straighter, it's as simple as squeezing both sides together. What I mean by that is get a hand on one side, get a hand on the other side, and just squeeze the two sides together. It's a really simple method to do and works really well. It doesn't damage the spokes in any way, and now they'll be running a lot straighter towards the rim. So there we go, fingers crossed that made sense. And if this is your first time building a radial wheel, you've been following along perhaps, I really hope this has worked and you've now got a nice looking wheel in front of you. So let's step this up a little bit and I'll show you how to build one cross. So after building radial, which is the simplest lacing pattern, we've got one cross. And as you can tell by the extra colours, this is going to be slightly more complicated. And it's actually potentially more complicated than 2 or 3 cross because of the different options you got down at the flange. But I'll take you through a few different options, and once you've decided which one is best for you, I'll take you through the process of getting both key spokes in the right place, because yep, there's going to be 2 key spokes in this wheel build, and by the end of this you should have a one cross laced wheel. So ignoring the special colours for the 2 key spokes, you'll find we have 4 colours in this wheel. We've got silver, blue, pink and yellow. So whereas radial was built in 2 halves, we're going to build a 1 cross, 2 cross, 3 cross and 4 cross in quarters. Because now we're going to start offsetting the spokes on either side of the hub flange. Now I have seen some people still build one flange at a time, but personally I don't think this is the best way to do it. Because a bit like I mentioned with radial, if you've got a cross pattern on one side, it's actually really hard to thread the spokes through, as you'll have to interweave them in between the gaps in the spokes. By breaking the wheel down into quarters, working on one side of the flange at a time, it makes it a lot easier to thread the spokes between the bigger gaps. Hopefully this sounds simple enough, but don't worry if it doesn't. Once we start actually lacing the wheel, this will make loads more sense. So to start with, we're going to work with the first 8 spokes. And again, this is 8 because it's a 32 hole wheel. Obviously if you're building a 24, 28 or 36 or whatever, that number is going to be different. But it should be 1/4 of your total spoke count. And like radial, we're going to concentrate on the first key spoke first. Just like with radial, the key spoke is the most important spoke you're going to put in a wheel, so you need to get this one right. But fortunately, just like radial, we can use the same trick to determine exactly where the key spoke goes on the hub. I'll show this process again, even though it is very similar to radial, just in case you skipped radial to find the lacing you're going to use. Again, ideally your hub will have a logo. We're going to try and line this up with the valve hole so you can see the logo through the valve. And again, this doesn't give any structural advantage, it's just how professional wheel builders build their wheels. If your hub doesn't have a logo, then you can skip this step and just choose any hole to start with. Using the logo has no benefit other than lining it up with the valve hole. And again, I don't recommend one cross for a disc use, so let's pretend this is a non-disc front hub. So assuming you're building a one cross wheel on a non-disc front hub, it really doesn't matter which side of the hub you start on. So for finding the key spoke position, let's assume your hub does have a logo. Just by eye, you want to try and find the center point of that logo, and then draw an imaginary line towards you through the hub and the flange you're about to lace. Now with radial, we just decided which was the closest hole to the center line that we just drew. However, that is not the hole we're going to put the key spoke in for one cross. Now I absolutely love this rule for finding the first hole for the key spoke. Instead of putting the key spoke in the hole closest to the center line, for one cross we're going to jump one spoke hole to the left. Now this is where the genius comes in. If you want to do 2 cross, you jump 2 holes to the left. If you want to do 3 cross, you jump 3 holes. And if you want to do 4 cross, you jump 4 holes. Following this simple rule means your hub logo will always line up with the valve. So just to quickly recap, you find the center line of your hub logo, draw an imaginary line towards you through the hub flange you're about to lace, and instead of going to that first hole closest to that center line, you jump one hole to the left. Once you've found your position for your key spoke, it's simply a case of inserting that into the hub. Now, to complicate things a little bit, much like Radial, you have a choice on which direction to put the spoke in, whether it's heads on the outside, shoulders on the inside, or heads on the inside and shoulders on the outside. Now, usually for lacing patterns with crosses, I put the spokes in going away from me with the heads on the outside, shoulders on the inside. However, I'll show you a few alternatives. So for a moment, let's imagine you've built it the way that I would usually build wheels, with the heads on the outside and shoulders on the inside. This is what it might look like once you got the first 8 spokes in. Normally when I build the second half of a flange, I will alternate the spokes. So instead of being heads out, shoulders in, the second half of this flange would be shoulders out and heads in. I would then weave the spokes over under each other at the crossing point. Now, the issue with doing it this way is that with one cross, you may actually have to bend the spokes quite severely to get them to do the over-under pattern. Now, spokes can take quite a lot of abuse. They can be bent quite far with not too many issues, but at the same time, you don't really want to bend them too much if you can avoid it. Now, this bend won't be as pronounced with a smaller flange, but you may find the bend is quite severe with a larger one. So alternating the spokes and doing an over-under pattern might actually work better with a smaller flange. Now, the other option is to still alternate the spokes on each side of the flange, but instead of doing an over-under weave on the crossing point, you can just let the spokes go their natural course and avoid bending them at all. Yet another option, instead of alternating the spokes on the flange with the heads in, shoulders out and shoulders out, heads in, you can just have all the spokes matching the same pattern. And like Radial, you have a choice of having heads out like we have here and shoulders in, or doing it the way I showed you, the opposite way. With this technique, you're still going to have some kind of bend at the crossing point, but it will be a less severe bend than having the spokes alternating heads in, shoulders out, heads in. But I must mention a disclaimer, I've never actually built a one-cross wheel, which is crazy because I've built literal thousands of wheels as a mechanic. But like I mentioned, one cross is an unusual build and one that I'd usually avoid building, either choosing to go Radial or adding an extra cross with 2 cross or 3 cross. So, for the rest of this one cross tutorial, I'm going to follow my usual pattern I use with 2 or 3 cross and alternate the spokes on the flange and then weave the spokes under over at the crossing point. If you're a wheel builder and you've ever built one cross, let me know down in the comments which method you prefer. So now you can probably see why I think one cross is one of the more complex lacing patterns out there. There's just so many different ways of doing it. Fortunately, that's the most complex part covered now. So let's get back to actually lacing the wheel. So we should have the key spoke in its correct position, which again is one spoke to the left of the spoke hole that's closest to the center line of the hub. And to find its position on the rim is exactly the same as Radial. We just follow it up and it goes one spoke hole to the left of the valve. This part's actually really easy to remember for all lacing patterns because the key spoke always goes in exactly the same position on the rim, which is one hole to the left of the valve. And like I mentioned, you can fit the key spoke on its own solo without any of the other spokes, or if you're like me, you'll have all the other spokes kind of dangling down from the hub like so. Just remember when fitting the rest of your spokes that this is an alternating pattern, so they'll be fitted every second hole on the flange. Like with Radial, just be careful that your hub doesn't twist around on its axis. It didn't matter so much for Radial, but as soon as you start to cross the spokes, it's absolutely vital that the hub doesn't spin around and face the other direction. It's quite easy for the hub to do this without you noticing, so make sure you're paying attention and it doesn't happen. This was actually one of my biggest errors when I first started building wheels, that the hub would spin around, I wouldn't notice it, and when I came to finish the pattern, my valve no longer matched up with the logo on my hub. And it's not just lining up with the logo that's the issue. There's an even bigger issue, but I'll explain that more when we get to 3 cross. Once you've fitted the rest of your first quarter to the hub, you need to fit those to the rim. Now with Radial, we went every 2 holes. But because we're building this wheel in quarters, it's actually every 4th hole. It is possible to do this by eye, but I would recommend actually counting every 4th hole on the rim just to make sure you don't get it wrong. Because everyone makes mistakes. Like I mentioned, I've built thousands of wheels and I still occasionally get this wrong if I don't count them out. So it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, spoke in, 1, 2, 3, 4, spoke in, and repeat that pattern until you've done the first quarter. It doesn't matter which way you go with these spokes, left or right, as long as you count every 4th hole on the rim. And once your first 8, or whatever number your first quarter spokes are fitted, it should look a little like this. Once again, a bit like Radial, don't worry if the spokes and nipples are actually protruding out of the rim ever so slightly. Again, this is more noticeable with a shallower rim. I've got the hub drawn here in its end twist position. But actually at this point, before you've set the pattern, the spokes will naturally just want to sit radially from the hub, and it's only actually after the third quarter of spokes that we twist the hub and set the correct angle of the spokes. So yeah, don't worry if at the moment the spokes look like the radial. If you've got the key spoke in the correct position, then later on when we twist the hub, everything will be fine. And yes, I've just realised what I've accidentally drawn. There's no way that would escape the comment section. So if everything's going to plan, we've got our first 8 spokes all in place. Now we're going to move on to the other flange and fit the second quarter spokes, starting with the second key spoke. And like I've mentioned, this is the second most important spoke you're going to put in a wheel, so let's make sure you get this right. So here we have the other side of the flange. Now I've actually drawn the rear hub here, so I started on the drive side and now we're on the opposite side, which is the disc side. But like I said, we're pretending this is a front non-disc hub. Also, the angle these spokes are going in don't match a 1-cross wheel. I actually copied this off my 4-cross wheel, so the angle of your spokes may be different. But it doesn't really matter, as finding the second key spoke position works the same no matter what your lacing pattern. Firstly, we want to identify the first key spoke. Then the trick is to follow that spoke down to the hub, look to see where it enters the hub, which if it isn't obvious is there, and much like when we drew an imaginary line from the center of the hub logo towards you over the flange you're about to work on, we do the same thing, except this time starting with the key spoke position where it enters the hub. So we draw a line directly through the middle of the hub towards you over the flange you're about to use. Spoke flanges are normally offset slightly from each other. This means this imaginary line you've just drawn through the hub may actually end up in between 2 spoke holes. So then the trick is to follow the direction the first key spoke is going, and it's that direction which indicates the position for the second key spoke. Another way of thinking about it is if you're looking at the hub from this direction, the second key spoke goes on the right of that imaginary line. So just to recap, you follow the first key spoke to the hub, draw an imaginary line from where that spoke enters the hub, across the hub to the flange you're about to lace, and either follow the direction that first key spoke is going to find the correct side of that imaginary line. Or the other way of doing it is just going to the right hand side of that imaginary line if you're looking at the hub from the opposite side. Insert the spoke matching the first quarter you did, with shoulders on the inside and heads on the outside. Once fitted, it will look a little something like this. And as usual, it's your choice if you want to fit the second key spoke to the rim now, or do what I do and add the rest of this quarter. No matter which way you choose, we now need to get the second key spoke in the correct hole on the rim. Fortunately, this couldn't be easier. If we spin the wheel around, so we're back on the original side, where the first key spoke went to the left of the valve hole, the second key spoke simply goes to the left of the first key spoke. And this is the first hole to the left. We're not skipping any holes on the rim here. Because the second key spoke is on the opposite flange, this will set the alternating spoke pattern on the rim. So just to quickly recap, we've spun the wheel around so we're looking at it from the original direction where the first key spoke went to the left of the valve hole. The second key spoke simply goes to the left of the first key spoke, not skipping any holes on the rim. And this pattern carries around the rim for the rest of the second quarter. And there are 2 ways to make sure you get this right, either counting every 4th hole on the rim, or by putting the second quarter spokes to the left of the first quarter spokes. Either way, once they're fitted, it should look a little like this. So now it's time to add the third quarter spokes. These are the rest of the spokes on the original flange that you started on. These are the blue coloured ones that are used on the close-up flange picture when explaining the different lacing options. When adding the third quarter spokes, we're going to be doing alternating spokes on the flange. So this means the spokes will be fitted coming towards you. I find it easiest to fit these spokes to the wheel facing the other way, and then it's just a case of pushing the spokes in away from you. Because we've already done the 2 key spokes, it actually doesn't matter at all what order you put any of these spokes in. So pick a hole, put the spoke in, and repeat until you've filled all the available holes in this flange. Now when fitting these third quarter spokes is the really important moment you make sure the hub has twisted the correct direction. Fitting these spokes will lock the twist into place, so make sure you're rotating the hub anti-clockwise. And when you're fitting these spokes, it's now up to you whether you choose to go under over or just go straight over in one of the options I showed you earlier. If you're going under over, the easiest way to do it is thread the spoke between the biggest gap, behind the spoke you're threading it through, then back through this gap, and it's ready to be put in the rim. An easy way to remember where it goes in the rim is it goes left of the previous spokes that you've put in. Or another way to know is it goes every 2 from the previous spokes you put in on this side flange, And then it's up to you if you want to count every 4 after that, or if you want to just put it to the left of every other spoke that you've put in. Once your third quarter of spokes are fitted, it should look like this. Now it's simply a case of adding the last quarter spokes, and then your lacing should be finished. To add this last quarter, it's simply a case of repeating what we just did with the last lot of spokes. It's exactly the same process, only now you've got a slightly tighter gap in between the spokes to thread it. But by building the wheel in quarters, we've always left the biggest gaps to make it easier to thread the spokes through. It should be fairly obvious where these spokes go on the rim because there's only going to be a few holes left. Just be aware when you're fitting these spokes, it can be quite easy to scratch the rim. But if you take your time and take a little care, you can flex the spokes and get them fitted to the rim without scratching it at all. And that is one cross done. Even though this isn't the most common lacing pattern in the world, I felt it's still worth going into detail on how to do it. So I hope this was useful. If it was, let me know. So if you've skipped ahead in the video, welcome to 2 cross. Or if you're watching this video from start to finish, well done on getting this far. Like I mentioned a lot earlier in the video, 2 cross is the start of the more practical lacing patterns. Now I wouldn't recommend 2 cross for extreme use, but for road riding, cross country, or if you're a lighter rider, is a perfectly usable pattern to use. Now the good thing about 2 cross is it's actually less complex than 1 cross. But saying that, it is still slightly more involved than radial. There's now not as many usable options when you put the spokes into the hub. Although I'm sure there's many options, I'm just going to show you one because I think this is the most useful. Just like 1 cross, we're going to split lacing this wheel into quarters. And again, if you didn't see the 1 cross pattern, that's because we alternate the spokes on each side of the flange. So by concentrating on one side of the flange at a time, it makes the build a lot simpler. Now when it comes to lacing 2 cross, there's a chance you may be using a front disc hub, or using it on the drive side of the rear. Whereas with 1 cross and radial, we were pretending that you were building a non-disc front hub, where it didn't matter which side of the hub you started on. Now that we are using a disc hub, or the drive side rear, you need to start on the more important side first. So on a front hub, that would be the disc side, and on the rear hub, that would be the drive side. So let's get started. And just like 1 cross, we're going to concentrate on the first quarter. And like I've mentioned previously, my first quarter is 8 spokes because it's a 32 hole wheel. Your number of spokes here may differ if it's a different number hole wheel. But before we fit all 8 spokes, we're once again going to concentrate on the first key spoke. And like always, this is the most important spoke in the whole wheel, so let's get this right. I'm going to start on the rear wheel, but the process is exactly the same front or rear, just make sure you start on the more important side. Once again, your hub may have a logo. If it doesn't have a logo, you can skip this very first process and just choose any hole to start on. The only thing we're using the hub logo for is to line it up with the valve. And by lining it up with the valve means you can see it through the valve hole, which gives you bonus points from other wheel builders, and it also gives another advantage of giving you more space to put a pump in between the spokes. Now if you've seen the radial and 1 cross tutorial, you'll know what we do now. If you haven't, then here's a super easy way to find the position for this first key spoke. The first step is to eyeball where you think the center of the hub logo is, and from there draw an imaginary line down through the hub towards you and over the flange you're about to build. Again, if you saw the radial build, you know we put the spoke in the closest hole to that center line of the logo. And then the 1 cross users will know we go 1 hole to the left for 1 cross. And then the beauty is if you want to go 2 cross, it's 2 holes, 3 cross would be 3 holes, 4 cross would be 4 holes. By following this step and getting the key spoke in the correct place on the hub, your hub logo will always be visible through the valve hole. And it's such an easy technique to remember. Radial is closest to that center line of the logo, 1 to the left for 1 cross, 2 to the left for 2 cross, 3 for the left for 3 cross, and so on. Now unlike 1 cross where you had many options on how to put this key spoke in, either heads on the inside and shoulders on the outside, or heads on the outside and shoulders on the inside, I'd recommend with 2 cross and even 3 and 4 cross to start with the head on the outside and shoulders on the inside. Now I have heard other wheel builders say this is wrong, saying that in theory this won't cope quite as well with torque. However, in the real world I don't think it makes any difference at all, but it does make lacing the wheel a lot easier. So there's no real right or wrong way to do this. If you prefer to put the spoke in the opposite way to how I do it, that's absolutely fine, but for me personally this is the way I like to do it. Once you've got that first key spoke in position, it's up to you if you want to fit that to the rim now, Or do what I do and just fit the remaining 8 spokes, or whatever number you're working with, to the flange in one go now. Remembering to match that pattern with shoulders on the inside, heads on the outside, and alternating every second spoke on the flange. So once we found that key spoke position on the hub, which remember we found by finding the hub logo, drawing an imaginary line through the hub, and then from the spoke hole that's closest to that center line, counting 2 holes to the left. Now it's just a case of fitting it to the rim, and just like radial, 2 cross, even 3 and 4 cross, the key spoke always goes to the same spot on the rim, and that's 1 spoke to the left of the valve hole. As you can see here, I've added every single key spoke from radial, 1 cross, 2 cross, 3 cross and 4 cross, and they all go to the same spot in the rim, which is 1 hole to the left of the valve. So you're not skipping any holes, it's just the very first hole to the left of the valve. So after you've got it added to the hub and added to the rim, that is your key spoke set in position. While you've just got this single spoke in, like I mentioned with radial and 1 cross, it's vital that you don't let the hub twist around on its axis. If you put the wheel down or just let go of the hub in any way, it can be quite easy for it just to spin around and end up the opposite way around. So that would be the drive side will now be away from you, and the disc side on the front hub would also be away from you. You always want to make sure the most important side is the one that's facing you throughout this first process. Having the hub spin around on its axis is one of the biggest mistakes I used to make as a wheel builder. I'd put the wheel down for whatever reason, come and pick it back up again, the hub would spin around on its axis, I wouldn't notice, and then I'd be surprised when my spoke patterns didn't line up and I could no longer see the hub logo through the valve hole. Now it isn't just about being able to see the hub logo. You may notice there are different size gaps between the spokes. The aim is to have the biggest gap lined up with the valve. This is simply because it's easier to fit the pump head in a bigger gap here than it is one of the narrower ones. And these gaps are actually exaggerated once you get onto 3 and 4 cross. So making sure the hub doesn't twist on its axis, make sure that everything lines up perfectly. If you're like me and you have all your other spokes just kind of dangling down here, then it's time to fit those as well. If you haven't fitted these yet, that's absolutely fine, just go back a step and I'll explain how to do that. To fit the rest of your first quarter spokes to the rim is super easy. Just like before, we're counting every 4 holes on the rim. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and repeat until all spokes are fitted. And just like before, don't worry if the spokes and nipples are protruding from the rim just a little bit. It's natural at this point that there might be a lot of slack in the spokes, so having them protrude from the rim isn't a big issue. Once you fit the rest of the spokes, this slack will go away and the spokes will be pulled further into the rim. This is more noticeable on a shallow rim, but you may find it still happens on quite a deep one too. And just like before, I've shown this hub in its final position fully twisted. When you put the first 8 spokes in, everything will be so slack that the hub won't be twisted in its final position and the spokes will look more like they're radial. But don't worry, as long as you've got the key spoke in the right place, a little bit slack here is fine, so don't worry how it looks. So now that you have all your first 8 spokes in, it's time to get this second key spoke in the right spot. In case you missed it, all these wheels with a cross pattern have 2 key spokes. So we've already done one, and now it's time to do the other. The good news is, once you do have both of these in, that's the hardest part done, and the rest of the lacing is pretty simple. But just like your first key spoke, it's vital that this second key spoke is in the right spot. So let me show you how to do that. So this is the same image I used for 1 cross, and the reason why I'm using this again is because the technique is actually exactly the same. But again, if you've skipped the 1 cross build and come straight to 2 cross, let me show you how it's done. Now you can kind of ignore the angle these spokes are going at. I actually took a photo of my wheel with a 4 cross build, hence quite the tight angles. Your spokes may look different, but it doesn't matter, the technique is still the same. Firstly, you want to locate your first key spoke. Then it's a case of following that down towards the hub and taking note of where it enters the flange. And just like when we fitted the first key spoke, where we drew an imaginary line from the logo across towards the flange we're going to be working on, we're going to do the same thing here, except from where the spoke enters the hub. So draw an imaginary line over the hub towards the flange you're going to work on. Because if I didn't mention it, the second key spoke goes on the other flange. And speaking of flanges, both sides are actually offset ever so slightly. So it's more than likely that this imaginary line will end up in between 2 spoke holes. To find the correct hole, there's a couple of ways you can do it. One technique is just to follow the direction the first key spoke is going, and that directs you past that center line to the hole beyond it. The other way is just to look at the hub from this angle, and the second key spoke simply goes on the right hand side of that imaginary line. So here's another angle of the rear hub, the drive side hidden behind this flange. And I've removed all the other spokes just to make it a little bit simpler. This is the first key spoke that we fitted, the very first spoke of the whole wheel. So even though this hub is at a different angle, it's still the same principle. We find the point where the spoke enters the hub, we draw an imaginary line towards you over the flange you're about to work on. You'll find it's in between two spoke holes. We follow the direction the original spoke is going, and that indicates which hole we're going to go in. Or simply just go on the right hand side of that imaginary line. This is the hole that the second key spoke will go in. We're going to do this heads out, shoulders in to match the first key spoke. Once that's fitted, it should look a little bit like this. And again, it's entirely up to you if you want to fit the second key spoke to the rim now, or again, do what I do and add the rest of the 8 spokes to this flange. But it doesn't really matter if you fit this one now, or have all the rest fitted, which will probably be dangling down here somewhere like that. We're still going to fit this spoke first. Now I've got the wheel orientated the same as I started, so the most important side is now back facing me. And you'll see that second key spoke is to the left of the first key spoke. We're just going to keep this pattern going at the rim and just go one to the left of the key spoke on the rim as well. Because these two spokes are on different sides of the flanges, they can go next to each other on the rim. What you absolutely don't want is two spokes from the same side of the flange going next to each other on the rim. The spokes always alternate. Once you've got the second key spoke attached to the rim, it's just a case of going around and attaching the rest of those spokes. To get the correct positioning, you can either count every 4 on the rim, or just by putting them on the far side of the spokes that are already fitted. To be on the safe side, I tend to count. Now even though I've built thousands of wheels, I still tend to count, because believe it or not, I still can get these spokes in the wrong place. But as long as this second key spoke is to the left of the first key spoke, and you follow that pattern along, you should be okay. Once again, I've got the hub pictured in its final position with its full twist. Just like when you added the first 8 spokes, you may find that the spokes protrude through the rim. Because you haven't locked the pattern or the spokes into place yet, they're still going to be very loose. But after we've added the next quarter, the pattern will get locked into place, you'll have the twist on the hub, the spokes will get tighter, and they shouldn't stick out of the rim anymore. And speaking of the next quarter, that's what we're going to do next, but fortunately, because we've got both key spokes in place now, things get a lot more simple. Because we're working in quarters, we're just going to alternate. So we started on this flange, then we moved to this flange, and now we're going to move back to the first flange, except on the opposite side. Because the first spokes went in with the heads on the outside and shoulders are inside, and like I mentioned, we're going to alternate the pattern, the third quarter spokes will do the opposite way with the heads on the inside and the shoulders on the outside. And these are a lot easier to insert from the other side of the hub. And like I've mentioned quite a few times, because we've got the 2 key spokes in position now, that is the pattern set. So when adding these third quarter spokes, it doesn't actually matter which hole you start with. There should be only 8 holes left, or however many for your build. So go ahead, just pick a hole, insert your spokes, and as long as you got them going the correct way, it's impossible to get this part wrong. I've removed the second quarter spokes, so now we can only see the spokes that are on this side flange. Just makes it a little bit clearer to explain the over-under pattern. The over-under pattern is pretty much how it sounds. These 4th quarter spokes go over one spoke and under another. Because this is 2 cross and we've literally only got 2 crosses, it really is as simple as over the first spoke and under the second. Once you start getting more crosses, you might go over the first 2 and under the third, or over the first 3 and under the 4th. I've added back in the second quarter spokes, as this way I can show you more clearly how to thread these third quarter spokes through the other ones. Because we're building the wheel in quarters, we now have quite a big gap here. So when fitting these third quarter spokes to the rim, we take the spoke and we put it through the bigger gap. Behind the spoke is going to go behind, and then back towards you through the smaller gap, and then up towards the rim. So just to repeat, you take the spoke up through the big gap, behind the spoke on the same side flange, then back towards you and up to the rim. This will give you the over pattern on the first spoke and the under pattern on the second. And like I've mentioned a few times, the spokes always alternate, so as long as you don't end up with 2 spokes on the same side flange next to each other on the rim, you should be good to go. And like I said with 2 cross, you can always follow the pattern of going to the left of the previous spokes that you've put in. It's at this point when you're adding the third quarter spokes that is vital you have the hub twisting the correct direction. Once you've fitted these next spokes, that's it, the wheel is locked in position, and if you twist the hub the wrong way, you won't get the logo to line up, and you won't get a bigger gap up at the valve to fit a pump head. So just remember, always twist the hub anti-clockwise. Once you've fitted those spokes, that's your wheel 3/4 done. If your spokes were protruding from the rim, you'd probably find they no longer are. To finish off the lacing, just a case of fitting the 4/4 spokes. This process is identical to the 3/4 that I just showed you, except we're now doing them on the last quarter of the flange. So just remember, that's heads on the inside and shoulders on the outside. And then simply repeating the over-under technique that I showed you. It's going to be pretty simple to know where these last remaining spokes go, because there will only be a set number of holes left on the rim. And as long as you have the heads and the shoulders the right way round, and you follow the correct over-under technique, these last quarter spokes should go in with no problems at all. Although saying that, the spokes will no longer be baggy, so if you've got the correct length spokes, it may just take a slight manhandling of the rim and the spokes to get the nipples screwed on. Sometimes the nipple heads can get caught in the rim, which may make it seem like some of the spokes are too short, but don't be scared to give the hub some manhandling to pull the nipples out of the rim and give you a bit more room to fit the spokes. It's kind of hard to explain, but should make sense once you get to this stage in the lacing. And it's also at this point where a nipple driver really starts to come in useful. And there you have it. Fingers crossed, if you've been following along, you now have a laced 2-cross wheel in front of you. It shared a lot of the tricks of the 1-cross, but because there's fewer options on how to actually put the spokes in the hub, I feel 2-cross is a slightly simpler lacing pattern. If you've been using this video to help you lace a 2-cross wheel, let me know how it went. I really hope this helped you. Right, let's move on to the most common lacing pattern, 3-cross. So, here we are, 3-cross. It's taken us over an hour of the video to get to the most common lacing pattern. If you've skipped forward to this bit, welcome, I really hope this helps you. But if you're part of the 1 hour club, you've watched the video from the start and got to here, then well done, you deserve a medal. If you are here from the start, then I will be repeating some of the points I've already made, just for the people who have skipped forward to this part. So if you think I'm being repetitive, that's the reason why. So near the start of the video, I already went over the pros and cons to 3-cross. So let's get stuck in and actually lace this up. Just like with all the previous lacing patterns, we're going to start with the very first spoke, which is the key spoke. The most important spoke of the entire wheel, so let's make sure we get this in exactly the right spot. Now again, like 2-cross, you want to start lacing the most important side of the wheel first. So for the rear wheel, that would be the drive side, and on the front wheel, that would be the disc side. Although there's still a chance you're building a non-disc front hub, in which case it doesn't really matter which side you start on. Like my previous 2-cross lacing tutorial, I'm going to show this process on the rear hub. But this 3-cross lacing pattern is identical no matter which wheel. Now the same as 1-cross and 2-cross, we're using 4 different coloured spokes. This is because we're going to build the wheel in quarters. We have 2 flanges and each flange has 2 sides. So we're going to start with this side, move on to this side, go back to this side and finish on this side. It is possible to lace one flange at a time, but once you start having spokes crossing each other, it can be really hard to thread the spokes through the small gaps. So by breaking it down into quarters, we give ourselves the most space for the spokes. So how do we get this key spoke in exactly the right position? Well, if you're a member of the 1 hour club, you'll know exactly how to do this. But let's go through it again for those who have just joined in. Most hub manufacturers these days will have a logo somewhere on the hub, ideally like Industry 9 have, nice and clear in the middle of the hub. If your hub doesn't have a logo, then don't worry about this first step, you can literally start on any hole you like. The only reason we're using the hub logo is so that it lines up with the valve hole. If you check out any professionally built wheel, you'll always be able to see the hub logo through the valve hole. This doesn't in any way help with the strength of the rim, it's just a sign of a quality build. If there's no logo, then you can start anywhere because you don't have to worry about lining it up. But anyway, assuming your hub does have a logo, here's what you do. You want to eyeball where you think the center of the logo is, and from that point, draw an imaginary line through the hub towards you over the flange you're about to lace. The hole closest to that center line is where you'd put radial. If you jump 1 hole to the left, that's 1 cross. If you jump 2 holes to the left, that's 2 cross. If you jump 3 holes, that's 3 cross. And if you jump 4 holes, that's 4 cross. So in this instance, we find the hole closest to that center line to the logo, and then we jump 3 holes to the left. This is the hole that your key spoke will go in. The beauty of this system is, no matter which lacing pattern you choose, by following this technique, your hub logo will always be visible through the valve hole. So just to repeat the process one more time, really get it drilled in, we find the center of the hub logo. From that we draw an imaginary line towards us over the flange we're about to lace. We find the spoke hole that's closest to the center line, and for 3 cross we jump 3 holes to the left. And that is the position of your first key spoke. And like I said, if you're building a front wheel, this technique is identical. Now if you watched my 1 cross tutorial, you'd have seen it's quite complicated because there's quite a number of ways you could put the spokes into the flange. You could have them alternating from heads in, shoulders out to shoulders out, heads in. Well, you'd be pleased to know that 3 cross is a lot simpler. Because we'll now have more crossing points, there are more limitations on where the spokes can go. I'm going to be showing you my preferred method, which is having the heads on the outside and the shoulders on the inside. Some people may insist that the other way is correct, with the shoulders on the outside and the head on the inside, something to do with the angular spokes better coping with the torque, but I feel in the real world it doesn't actually make any difference. I don't think there's a right or wrong way to do it, this is just my preferred method, but I do think the way I do it makes the lacing slightly easier, and I'd take easier lacing over a theory of more torque any day of the week. Once your key spoke is fitted, it's up to you if you want to fit that individually to the rim now, or do what I do for a bit of time saving and fit the rest of the 8 spokes now. And again, the same with 1 and 2 cross, I'm mentioning 8 spokes because that is 1/4 of my wheel, which is a 32 hole. If your wheel has a different number of spokes, then this number will be different. But no matter what number it is, it's always every second hole on the flange. Because we're only doing one side of the flange at a time, we'll fit the remaining spokes later on. The plan is to have the spokes alternating from one side of the flange to the other. So no matter if you're fitting this spoke solo, or if you have all the other spokes dangling down like I would, we now need to fit this spoke to the correct place on the rim. And once again, all the folk in the 1 hour club will know exactly where this spoke goes, and that's the hole to the left of the valve hole. Because we went to the left of where the logo is on the hub, the valve will now line up perfectly. It's such a brilliant system, no matter where your key spoke goes, it always goes to 1 spoke left of the valve. This means no matter what your lacing pattern, the valve always lines up with the hub logo. So just to make this absolutely double clear, we found the hub logo, we drew an imaginary line over the flange towards the one we're going to build, we found the spoke hole closest to that line, and then for 3 cross we jump 3 spokes to the left. The spoke goes heads out, shoulders in, goes up to the rim, and goes 1 hole left of the valve. Now I'll mention this later on as well, but you may notice my hub is twisted in its final rotation. You probably find at this point the hub just wants to naturally sit straight, so the spoke will look more like a radial. But don't worry about that, as long as you got the key spoke in the right position, it doesn't matter if the hub flops about a bit. However, at this point, before you fit the rest of this quarter of the spokes to the rim, it's vital you don't let the hub twist around on its axis. If this is the rear hub, where we started on the drive side, we always want the drive side pointing towards us at this point. And if this is the front hub, you want it to be the disc mount. It can be so easy at this point to either let go of the hub and the rim, maybe you've put the wheel down for something, or you've just let your concentration slip. If you allow the hub to spin around on its axis, you're going to lose all the advantages of finding this key spoke position. You'll no longer be able to see the hub logo through the valve hole, and more importantly, as I'll explain later, you'll have less room to fit a pump to the valve. When I was younger and building my very first wheels, this was a mistake that caught me out more than once. So learn from my mistakes and don't let that hub spin around on its axis. Now that you've made sure the hub is the correct way around, we can go around and fit the rest of this quarter. Because we offset the spokes on the hub and went every 2, we now offset the spokes on the rim and go every 4. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, spoke in, 1, 2, 3, 4, spoke in, and just repeat that until you've completed all the spokes. Again, like I mentioned, my hub is rotated in this drawing, but more than likely your hub won't be. And because of this, it means your spokes will be a lot baggier in a wheel, and it's more than likely some spokes will be protruding out of the rim. This is more common on a shallower rim, but may even still happen on quite a deep one like this light bicycle one. And you may find some stick out more than others, probably on one half of the wheel, This is just because the hub won't be sat central to the wheel at this point. So what I'm saying is, don't worry if your spokes are sticking out, and don't worry if they're sticking out more on one side than the other. This will likely be the case until we fit the third quarter of spokes. It's at that point that we set the rotation of the hub, which will pull all the spokes back into the rim. So hopefully this is all making sense. We found the location of the key spoke on the hub and the rim, and then we counted every 4 holes on the rim to find the location for the rest of the spokes for this quarter. Ideally, that's gone well for you, and that is the first quarter done. The wheel is now 1 quarter laced. So next up is to find the second key spoke, which is this one here. This is the first spoke on the second flange and is the second most important spoke you need to get right. Once you've got these 2 spokes in exactly the right place, the rest of the wheel should just fall into place. Now, just how we had a really simple trick to find the first key spoke position, there's another simple trick to find the second one, and I'll take you through that right now. To put the second key spoke in, I flipped the wheel around so I'm now looking at the opposite flange. And I'm actually going to give you a 2-for-1 deal here. Not only do I have one tip, but earlier in this video I alluded to a little trick how you can have different spoke lacing patterns on either side of the wheel, and I'm going to show you how you do that. But once again, if you're a member of the 1 Hour Club, you'll recognise this picture. We've used it multiple times before, but that's the beauty of this system. It works no matter what your spoke lacing pattern. So I've drawn the hub here fully twisted in its final position. It's up to you if you want to do that and match this, but it's not necessary. The same tricks will still apply, and here's how we do them. Step number 1, we locate the position of the very first key spoke. This will be on the flange pointing away from you now. We follow that down to the hub and take note of where it enters the flange. And much like earlier, where we found a hub logo and drew an invisible line over the hub towards the flange we're going to work on, we're now going to do the same thing, except drawing that line from where the first key spoke enters the hub. So that's an imaginary line from the first key spoke position over the hub to the flange you're about to lace. As I've mentioned with the previous patterns, spoke flanges are slightly offset, so your imaginary line might end up in between 2 spoke holes. This is totally fine, but which spoke hole do you choose? Now there's 2 ways to do this. The first, if your hub is twisted like this, is you can just follow the first key spoke to the hub, you just follow the direction of that spoke, and that will indicate which side of the imaginary line you need to go. Or to put it simply, if your spokes aren't twisted, you can just go to the right hand side of that imaginary line. This hole will be your position for your second key spoke. That's assuming you want 3 cross on both sides. I'm now going to share with you the tip that allows you to have a different spoke lacing pattern on this side of the hub. So by using the previous technique, we've discovered that this is the position for the key spoke if we were going to go 3 cross. Now, much with the original key spoke, where we jumped spoke holes until we got to the cross number that we wanted, we're going to do exactly the same with the second key spoke position. So we've determined that this hole is where the spoke goes for 3 cross. If you wanted this side to be 2 cross, you just jump 1 hole back to the left. If you wanted 1 cross, it's 2 holes. And if you wanted radial, it's 3 holes. So essentially, we're undoing the 3 cross pattern. And this technique works the other way as well. If you want to do 4 cross on this side of the flange for whatever reason, you just count 1 hole to the right. So just to recap this quickly, get it drilled in, we find the first key spoke, the very first spoke we fitted, follow it up to the hub, take note of where it joins the flange, draw an imaginary line across the hub to the flange we're about to lace, and if we're going 3 cross, it's 1 hole to the right of this imaginary line. If we're going 2 cross, we jump 1 hole back to the left. If we're going 1 cross, we jump 2 holes to the left, and if we're going radial, we jump 3 holes back to the left. Or we can do this opposite way. For 4 cross, we jump 1 hole extra to the right. I hope that makes sense, because I really do like this technique, and I really want it to work for you guys as well. Now, for the purposes of 3 cross, I'm going to put my second key spoke through this hole here. And that's matching the pattern we did with the first quarter, with the heads on the outside and shoulders on the inside. And once that's in position, it will look a little something like that. I've got a second angle of the rear hub here, with the drive side hidden behind this flange, and I've removed the spokes for easier viewing. I'm just going to quickly run through one more time exactly how to get both key spokes in exactly the right place. That first initial key spoke was fitted because we jumped 3 holes away from that first hole closest to the center line. From that key spoke position, we draw another imaginary line across the hub to the other flange we're about to work on. And from there, we can either continue the angle the spoke is going to decide the direction to go to find our second key spoke position, or just go to the right hand side of that imaginary line. That is your position for 3 cross. 4 cross would be 1 extra hole further along, 2 cross would be back 1 hole, 1 cross would be back another hole, and radial would be back once more. We then fit that second key spoke through this hole for 3 cross, matching the first spokes with the heads on the outside and shoulders on the inside. And once again, it's up to you if you want to fit the second key spoke to the rim right now, or follow my slight time saving technique and fit all 8 spokes now. No matter if you choose to do this solo now, or have all the other spokes dangling down, we still need to get this second key spoke in the right place on the rim. So with the wheel flipped back around so the drive side is facing you, or the disc side if it's front, where the first key spoke went to the left of the valve hole, the second key spoke will now be left of the first key spoke, and that simply goes into the next hole to the left of the key spoke on the rim. Then it's simply a case of following this pattern of going to the left of the first quarter spokes for the rest of this second quarter. And of course the other way you can do it is to count every 4 spoke holes from that second key spoke position. Now like I mentioned earlier, my hub is pictured here fully rotated. And just like before, yours is unlikely to be like this just now. So once again, don't worry if your spokes are sticking out of the rim. We're now going to fit the third quarter of spokes. This will set the cross pattern, and this is where we'll initiate the twist of the hub. Now the good news is, now that we've got both key spokes in, the rest of the spokes are just a walk in the park. There's no longer any super specific place they need to go. So let's take you through the third quarter. So just like I mentioned, these third quarter spokes don't have any specific hole they need to go in first. Now that we've switched back to our original flange, which on the rear is the drive side and disc on the front, you can literally pick any hole you want for your first spoke. The only important thing is that you want these spokes to alternate with the spokes that are already in there. So if you remember, we have heads on the outside and shoulders on the inside. This third quarter of spokes are fitted from the other side of the hub and will end up with the shoulders on the outside and the heads on the inside. I normally flip the wheel around so the drive side or the front disc side is facing away from me, as I find it a lot easier to thread the spokes in from this direction. If we go back to the side profile of the wheel and remove the second quarter spokes, it gives a slightly clearer idea of how we're going to lace these third quarter. This is where it's vital that you twist the hub in the correct direction, which is anti-clockwise. Twist it the wrong way and your logo won't line up anywhere near the valve. Not only that, but you'll give yourself a smaller gap, making it harder to fit a pump head onto the valve. As you can see, these gaps are all different sizes, and if you twist the hub the wrong way, you actually end up with the valve at the smallest gap possible. And trust me, I'm not making it up, this does actually make it harder to pump up your tyre. So just remember to make sure you twist your hub anti-clockwise. Once you've done that, these third quarter spokes will actually go in the opposite direction to your first spokes. And this is where we're going to set the over-under pattern. Because we're crossing at 3 points, we're actually going to go over the first 2 crossings, and then we're going to go under the third. So that's over right down on the flange, over on the second crossing, and then under on the third. I've now added back in the spokes that we've put in so far, and as you can see, there's a little bit of weaving you need to do to get these new spokes in. But because we built our wheel in quarters, we now have a nice big gap here, which helps make weaving these spokes through easier. Because the first crossing is so close to the flange, the actual act of weaving these spokes through isn't much different than 2 cross. And we did that by taking a spoke up through the biggest gap, behind the other spoke, and then back towards you, threading it in between and up towards the rim. This will give you your over, over, under pattern. When fitting the spokes to the rim, there's a couple of options on how you make sure you get the correct hole. One option is to find a spoke from the same side flange and just count 2 spoke holes away from that. Or the other option, because we'd be going left of the valve and then the second key spoke went left to that, you can simply go to the left of that one again. Just getting 1 spoke in will now lock the hub in its rotation, and then it's just a case of repeating the process with the rest of this quarter. After you've added the twist and the rest of the spokes, you'll notice that any protruding spokes have now been pulled into the rim. Done right, your wheel should look something like this. And the good news, all you need to do now is fit the last quarter, which is exactly the same process we just did. Just be sure to have the spokes alternating on the hub and have the heads and shoulders the correct way round. Get your 3 crossing points and then attach to the rim. Now knowing where these spokes go on the rim is going to be super easy. Because these are the last spokes, there's only a set number of holes they can actually go in. Now even if you've got exactly the right length spokes, you may find that they actually come up a little bit short. This might be because some of the nipples have got caught and snagged inside the rim. So to loosen it up, don't be scared of giving the hub a good shake and manhandle. Once everything pops into place, you'll find you have plenty of room to fit these last spokes. Although you may still need to use a nipple driver, especially if it's a deep section rim like this light bicycle one. So if it's all gone well, you should have a wheel looking like this. Your hub logo should line up with the valve. You should have the biggest gap possible here for a pump head. You should have 3 spoke crossing points with an over-over-under pattern. If not, don't worry, go back a few steps and hopefully you'll see where you went wrong. But hopefully I explained this well enough and now you have a fully laced wheel. If you've used this tutorial to help you lace a 3-cross wheel, I'd love to know how it went for you. Please hit me up in the comments and let me know. So now there is only one lacing pattern left. But rather than show you with a drawing, I figured because I'm actually using this pattern myself, we should put all this theory into practice. So let's go back to my garage and I'm going to run through a 4-cross build as quick as I can. Because most of the tips are exactly the same as 3-cross, but it might help you guys to visualize a real wheel while it's being done. Now that we've done the theory, let's put it into practice. I'm going to lace my rear hub here. I'm choosing the rear one because it's a dishless hub, meaning the spokes are the same length on both sides. So what I normally do is pick up what I think is 8 spokes, because we're going to put in the first 8 spokes on the drive sides, which, like I've said, is the more important side to start with. If this was the front hub, I'd be starting on the disc side. Now obviously the camera is pointing me, so I'm going to be using left and right as if I'm looking at the hub. So like I said, starting on the more important side, I find the logo on the hub, and then I find the corresponding hole which lines up the most closely to the center of the logo. Just to repeat, it doesn't matter if it's not exactly in the center, you just want to find the one which is closest. So because this is 4-cross, I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4 to my left, and that is where the key spoke goes. Once I've got the key spoke in, I tend to just keep a finger on it at all times, just so I don't lose it. It is up to you if you want to attach this to the rim now. Personally, I don't. I put the rest of the 8 spokes in. So that's a spoke every second hole, heads out, shoulders in, like the key spoke. So once all 8 spokes are in, I've still got hold of the first key spoke here, makes it just easier to find. I then grab the rim, I find the valve hole, which is exactly where this logo is, and then because the hub is going to be twisting to the left, I go 1 hole to the left as I'm looking at it on the rim. I then lock that spoke in place with a nipple. So that's the first key spoke in place. Now at this point the hub can actually rotate on that spoke, so it's important to keep that hub facing the same way. Remember, it's the drive side on the rear hub and the disc on the front hub that wants to be facing towards you at this point. When you're absolutely sure that the hub is the correct way and hasn't turned, you can add the rest of your spokes. Now this is every 4th spoke on the rim. Now I've been doing this for years and I can still get this wrong, so I still just count 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and it goes in this one here. It can be quite easy to scratch the rim with the spoke, so yeah, be careful when you're putting the spoke into the rim. Now the hub with 2 spokes in can still twist, but it's a lot more obvious because the spokes will cross. But now that you've got at least 2 spokes in, it's unlikely the hub will spin. Then it's simply a case of adding the spokes to every 4th hole until you've got the first 8 spokes in. So that's the first side done. I now grab another 8 spokes and we're going to fit the opposite side. There are 2 key spokes in a wheel build. The first spoke we put in and the first spoke we're going to put in on this side. These are the 2 most important spokes, so it's really important to get this right. So we find the first key spoke, which is the first spoke we put in. We follow that up to the hub. We look through the hub at the opposite flange and try and find where that corresponds to this opposite flange. Again, this may be between spoke holes, so we follow the spoke along and we go to the next spoke after where the key spoke is. Now I've actually got hold of the key spoke with my hand on the underside here, so I'm going to keep hold of that, and while I do, I'm going to add the rest of the spokes. And again, like before, this is every 2nd spoke with the heads on the outside, shoulders on the inside to match that first one. Once you've got hold of your 2nd key spoke, find your first key spoke, which is easy to find because that's the one up by the valve, and it goes into the spoke hole next to that. And that's your 2 key spokes locked in place. Once you've got your 2nd key spoke in, much like the first lot of spokes, it's then a case of fitting the rest of the 8. And again, much like the first lot of 8 spokes, it's every 4 holes on the rim. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So there we have it. That is the first 16 spokes. That's 8 spokes per flange, and the two most important spokes, the two key spokes, are fitted, so the pattern is locked in place from this point onwards. Now the keen-eyed amongst you may have noticed what direction my hub has spun. It's actually spun the wrong way, so again, it's really important to make sure it's turning the correct direction. It may take a little bit of manhandling to do it once the spokes are in, but make sure it is turning the correct way. So that is the first 16 spokes on either side of the flange. I'm going to now put in the next 8 spokes, and this is going back to the drive side, the side I started with, except instead of facing this towards me, I'm going to keep this facing away from me, because rather than having the heads on the outside and shoulders on the inside, we're going to flip that. We're going to do the opposite. We're going to have heads on the inside, shoulders on the outside. So by having the wheel facing away from me, I can just insert the spokes from the other side. Now the great thing now is, because we've already set the 2 key spokes, it absolutely doesn't matter which spokes go in first. This time you can put them in any way you want. You can just skip one, you can put one down there, you can put one over here. So it really doesn't matter what order you put those in. I find this next process easiest with the wheel vertically with the drive side on my right hand side. It's personal preference. If you want to do it with the wheel flat, it's completely up to you. But no matter which way you do it, this is where it is absolutely vital to make sure you have the correct direction twist on the hub, because as soon as you fit your first spoke, it's going to lock that twist in place. So double, triple check your hub is spinning the correct way, and then we can get on to fitting the next 8 spokes to the rim. Much like when we lace the wheel, it doesn't matter which spoke you start with, you can choose any one you like. And this is why I did the hub flanges alternately. Because there's a big gap on that side, because I haven't fitted all the spokes, I have a lot more room to wiggle this spoke underneath the other one. And again, just to repeat myself to get this absolutely dialed in for you guys, this is a 4-cross wheel, which is a bit unusual. So I'm going over the first 3, 1, 2, 3, and then it's going under the 4th one. If this was a 3-cross wheel build, I would go over the first 2 and under the 3rd. But like I said, this is 4-cross, so over the first 3, under the 4th, and then we go to the alternating hole on the rim. It's really important that you don't have 2 spokes on the same flange going to a hole next to each other. So you may find at this point it's going to be difficult to get the nipple through the rim without it falling in, especially on a deep profile rim like this. Some shallower rims may have the spoke pushed through far enough that you can just add the nipple by hand. So I'm going to get a spare spoke, thread the nipple on backwards just a turn or 2, then I can put that through the rim, get the spoke, and then screw it on by hand. Screw it on a couple times, remove this spoke just by turning it the opposite way. This is when I get my nipple driver, stick it through. On a deep profile rim like this, it might be hard to find it, but once you do, just give that a few turns. You don't want the thread to be completely gone, just thread it on a couple of turns, maybe 2, 3, 4 turns, just to have it securely locked in place and it's not going to rattle off while you're building the wheel. Now that that spoke is fitted, that is the directional twist of the hub absolutely fixed in place now. Now it's simply a case of repeating the process and adding the rest of the spokes to the rim. You don't have to go in order, but I do recommend going in order, starting from the first spoke you put in and just making your way around. It just stops any confusion to where they need to be, because you can just count 4 spokes from that first one. 1, 2, 3, 4, and that will go in that hole there. So simply repeat this process until all these 8 spokes are fitted. Easy peasy. Looking pretty good. And the good news is you've only got 8 more spokes to put in. I mean, if it is a 32 hole wheel. And you're on the home straight now. These are the easiest ones to put in. There's only 8 holes left in the hub, only 8 holes left in the rim. So it's exactly the same as what we've just done. You put the spokes in from the opposite side like before. Heads on the inside, shoulders on the outside, alternating on the flange. Doesn't matter where you put them, simply find a space and fit a spoke. It's easiest to find the straightest route possible. You may have to wiggle a spoke to get it through, but they should simply just plop through just like that. And if you're matching cross patterns on both sides, which we have done on this style of wheel, just repeat the cross method you did on the other side. So exactly like last time, over the first 3 and then under the 4th. So just repeat that process for the remaining spokes and you should have a laced wheel. And there we go, that is a fully laced wheel. Now because I got the twist the correct way, I have a bigger gap up at the valve. This gives you absolutely bags of space for a pump head to fit onto the valve. If you twist the hub the wrong way, you end up with a gap this size, and it just makes life a lot harder to get the pump head on. But most importantly, you get to see the hub logo through the valve hole. So there we go. Fingers crossed, if you followed this video, you now have a perfectly laced wheel. The next step is to add tension, get it trued, get it stressed, and get it finished, but I'm going to save that for another video. This has actually been one of the more difficult videos that I've done for a while. I've built thousands of wheels and I've known this technique for over a decade now, so it's kind of second nature, but to try and explain it to people in a way that is understandable, it's not that easy. I really hope you were able to follow along and what I was saying made sense. I hope my drawings made sense. I encourage you to let me know down in the comments if this video did help you. If you have a laced wheel or a fully finished wheel because of this video, please tag me on social media at Ali Clarkson on Instagram and Facebook. I'd love to take a look. I personally can't wait to finish building this wheel. I've actually had these hubs for months now. Sorry, Industry 9. I should have built them sooner, but I actually had to wait a long time for these rims to come because of the whole, pandemic making manufacturing slower than usual. But yeah, I've been loving the Chris King hubs, but having over 600 engagement points, this is going to be fun. So finishing this wheel is going to be a future video. So until then, please go subscribe if you haven't already. Please hit me up on Patreon if you want longer videos released earlier. What else is there? I have merch at aliclarkson.com. There's going to be some changes there. I want to add some more designs that I've designed personally. What else? Hit the notification button on YouTube. Drop a comment, thumbs up, all that stuff. Let me know about your builds and I'll catch you next time. So take care everyone. Have a great week. See you later. Bye bye.